Okay. Well, first thing I'd like to say good morning and good afternoon for those who are not with us in Aix-en-Provence. Welcome to this particular session of our seminar, which today is about a book that I'd like to introduce, but that I will mostly take as a pretext to discuss a fundamental issue that I believe historians should be addressing and that by and large they are not addressing. So the book is by Ian Milligan, and it's called History in the Age of Abundance, ? How the Web is Transforming Historical Research. It was published at the end of 2019. It's available online. You have to buy it. Ian Milligan is not someone who has just started to think about it. In fact, he's been involved for a long time in historical research. His field is Canadian history, but his other field is really what we often call digital history, for good or for bad. I will come back to that. He's been involved in the writing of several books apart from this one before. One of them is Exploring Big Historical Data, which speaks for itself in 2015. And he was also a contributor to the Historical Microscope. And he's also the principal investigator, the guy in charge of an initiative precisely to address the issue of web archives called Archives Unleashed Project. I will come back to that too. Okay. So why did I decide to discuss this book in particular? In fact, there are various reasons. Well, first, it's particularly relevant to what we do here in this project, but it is particularly relevant to historical research in general for today, and of course, even more for tomorrow. And I think that the book addresses a few pressing issues that historians should all consider, should all take into account, and that so far they have neglected. These are also issues that, in fact, we quite frequently discuss, at least between some of us here, and we do not have the answers. But on an everyday basis, when we do all these experiments, including with the people who work with us, like Jeremy here and Baptiste, we see the difficulty, the challenges, difficulties, and in fact, the potential of all that. Now, the book also formulates ideas, proposals, arguments that have been churning, if I may say so, in my head for a long time. It started with my seminar quite 12 years ago, where basically I was stating the same kind of argument, which is you cannot avoid dealing with the fact that the digital is radically changing the way we work as historians. Now, of course, the book is much better than my very simple thinking, because it formulates that very clearly, convincingly. And finally, the last reason why I was interested, that it intersects again with something I've been very much concerned with, which is basically how we do history, which is part of my training, part of what I've been doing for almost 3 decades now, which is to think about how we as historians find sources, process sources, discover, and above all, adopt new methodologies to make our sources speak. So what does the book present? Basically, it has 5 parts. I will go very quickly because then I will go into the arguments. Basically, it has a part on the library that's exploding. Exploding library means that we have tons of materials on the internet. The second part is devoted to this issue of web archives and the people who are, and when I say the people, we'll see that it's much more complicated than that, the people who are creating these archives. Third part is about how we access this. It's fine, we have tons of things, and tons of things that have been preserved. How do we access it? How do we get back to our lives? And the fourth one is precisely about methods, because we're looking for needles in a huge haystack, basically, when we look for something in web archives. And his fifth chapter, in fact, takes one example of something called GeoCities. I will come back to that. And he explains why and how it can make sense for historians to use these archives. And finally, he gives very concrete indications on how to, what tools exist, what is the state of the field in the book. Now, the most interesting part, of course, is the main question of the author. The main question is, the first one is, what does the digital do to our collective cultural heritage? So that's really what we are inheriting, what we're creating and inheriting from the present that goes into the past. How does it shape our sources? So basically, as a historian, we've been concerned mostly with this issue, and we're facing a radical shift. And what does it mean for the profession of historians? And when I say historians, of course, the book is about history and historians. But in fact, it concerns everyone, almost. I cannot think of really a discipline that's not concerned by this. If you think of humanists, of course, historians are a particular tribe, a different tribe. For what reasons? We do not work with just one corpus. Most of the time, we work with different corpora, different types of source, etc. Mostly text, definitely, even though we can expand on that. But when you think about people who do literature, it's different. They also deal with text, but mostly it's just, let's say, this literary text. You do not go into archives, you do not go into it. It's a different exercise. But of course now, and they were the first to be faced with this, that their corpora, were all becoming digital. So they were able to access not just 200 novels, but thousands, tens of thousands, and etc. Okay, but the same goes for a sociologist. Can you do sociology nowadays without taking into account what's going on the internet that you can see through Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., Google Trends? So it's the same issue for everyone. Now, the main argument of the book, which is not new, and this is the argument that you also found in the other paper that I circulated, an old one published in 2003. It was exactly with using the same word, scarcity or abundance. And of course, at the time, we're already thinking, realizing that historian would be facing a huge amount of documents with the advent of the internet. If you take concrete examples that he gives in his book, think about Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, you'll know him. He was a writer, he was a poet. He left 422 letters. That's all we have from him. And you measure this with what an average person now leaves as a trace on the internet in terms of email, tweets, Facebook posts, etc., etc. Instagram, YouTube, you name it. Okay. Of course, it's a particular example, but basically now everybody is almost producing something and leaving something of a digital trace. Because we have this, some organizations started to collect and gather data. One of them that you all know is the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive by 2012, so that was 10 years ago, already had 10 petabytes of data. And they made this calculation, which is a bit not really meaningful, but still, they said that if every byte was a human being, they had 94,000 times more than any soul that ever lived on the planet. And in fact, on that year, they also released an entire crawl of the whole internet for 2011. So you've got everything that they gathered in 1 year for the whole internet. Imagine what that represents. And this is almost nothing compared to what I will discuss later on. What does it change for historians? Well, it's not just the quantity, it's diversity. It's the fact that now we have a detailed record of the lives of millions, of tens of millions, of billions of people. Okay. And this is a record that did not exist just a few decades ago. Go back to 2000, go back to the 1980s, it did not exist. It did not, okay? Which means that now all of us in over 30 years, we've been accumulating an enormous amount of information created by the very people who are using the internet about their life. And somehow this is of utmost importance to historians, utmost relevance, because what we do is precisely study people, except that so far I've been studying dead people with dead documents. And the web is changing this to a certain extent. So somehow for historians to ignore internet is like ignoring print culture altogether. It's just the same. And we have not really addressed this. And we need to, because this is our way to write a more inclusive history. Not just the history that we've been, even though we have been trying to explore and study all sorts of topics, including the nobodies of history, prostitutes and art, etc. But basically, we know that we've been working with archives that have been created by the people who had knowledge, power, education, that were preserved by institutions. And so there is definitely a bias. There's always been a bias. And now we can go past that. We can go past that. It's not just that we can go past that. It means that we will not be able to write any kind of honest history for topics without this. Can you imagine studying, for instance, the issue of women, violence against women, sexual harassment or sexual violence against women without, or just with looking at government archive, police archive, judicial archives, and not looking at the Me Too movement? We're going through, it's not over yet, the COVID crisis or COVID pandemic. Can we imagine working on this just through government archives or just associations archive? Of course not. And I could go on and on about elections, about all sorts of things. So if we were to continue to work just as we've been doing before, which basically means traditional print sources, government documents, company documents, newspapers, and etc., that would be, as I said, dishonest. But it's not just that issue of using and studying, etc. The Web Archive also forces us to reshape the way we train, we write, we disseminate our histories. That's another point that we'll have to address. Now, somehow I'm presenting the bright side so far. Okay, we are saying, wow, that's fantastic. We have more and more materials, it's accessible, etc. Well, in fact, it's not true. It's not true. It's not true because, in fact, the digital, as you all know, is made up of two things. Okay, just ones and zeros. Okay, so it's extremely fragile because everything has to be transformed from these zeros, and one has to be transformed in some sort of a language, and a language that we can read because it's being transformed in an image, it's become transformed in a text, etc., etc. Now, I do not know how much you know about the history of the internet, but basically it started in the early 1990s. The first web page was published by CERN in December 1990. I will discuss that after. And in fact, when this emerged, there was nothing that was ready for preserving all of that. So yes, on the one hand, we had all of a sudden an exponential growth of these resources. But the issue is what happens when the lights go down? And it happens several times. Most of these providers that existed initially by and large in the US, but of course during Europe, at some point they just shut down what they were offering. If you take something like MySpace, which was offering the possibility to create spaces in between 2005 and 8, well, in 2008, it was shut down overnight, not just with 2 days notice, but not overnight. And nobody cared, okay? And somehow you can see how our values system is different. A few years ago, when there was this radical Islamic movement in Mali, and they were going to destroy the Timbuktu manuscripts that are medieval manuscripts, there was a huge public international outcry to save the manuscripts. In fact, smart people had already shipped them out, so they were safe. But at the same time, as we are prepared to defend these old manuscripts, we're not considering that the digital material that's being produced today are the manuscripts of tomorrow. Of course, it's more complex than that, but still we have this issue. Hometown by AOL, 10 years, same thing. After 10 years, people who had web pages, websites and that had 1 month's notice to transfer or lose. By and large, everything was lost. And it was at that time that a group of people came to the realization that they had to do something. Otherwise, it would just continue. And they set up a team that they called archive team, nothing fancy, group with a chat, with resources, with skills, with servers, with everything. And in fact, they were ready. And when the next shutdown came, it was GeoCities in 2009, then they saved everything. And they saved everything because they were prepared. Because one of the issues when you have to save things is that most of the providers will cap the amount of bytes that you can download during a period of time. If you do it by yourself, or if just 2 people want to do that, it's impossible. But if you have a team that use virtual machines, etc., then yes, they were able to gather everything. So somehow, even though we have been creating a lot of resources, there is another side, which is what we call the dark age, the digital dark age, that we have lost things. We do not know what we have lost. Okay, we never know, most probably. And this is important because we are now in 2022. Okay, and the history of the internet now has 30 years. 30 years, as you all know, I guess, if you have done research in history, this is basically the time period where you can have access to archive in most Western countries. That's, 30-year period. So somehow people who are now would have to look at the 1990s, would have this issue that, well, major chunks of things that were relevant have disappeared completely. And probably not just individual productions, probably also institutional productions, in fact. So we have this whole issue of an important digital gap in our collections, from the beginning of where we started to have connected computers to the internet to now, because even now we haven't really solved the issue, even if, as I will explain, there are, of course, things. And it's all the more important because the life expectancy of a website, the average life expectancy is between 44 days and 100 days, okay? So you can see the enormous turnover of these things. Even if I think back myself, I've produced several websites, web pages. I guess my first web pages were when we set up the Institute of East Asian Studies in Lyon in 1993. I have no idea what happened to these pages. Okay. I also created web pages for teaching in my university in 1999, just the same, they're gone. And then I moved to blogs to create my courses. And the initial ones, I didn't care to save them. In fact, I just, erase and et cetera, et cetera. So, and somehow this is important because in these syllabi, I and all my colleagues would do the same. You structure your lesson and then you select the readings, etc. So it reflects the way I was thinking at the time and my colleagues were thinking, and the same class wouldn't be taught the same way. So it's just an example. Same with emails. We had successive email addresses. Okay. What happened to everything we wrote since we started to use email? My first email was ch55@stanford.edu, 1990. Okay, I still have it. In fact, I still have it every time I go. But if I'm not connected, then my content is lost. And all my email addresses, all my correspondence, and it includes academic correspondence with my PhD students, with my colleagues, and everything, which you would consider as manuscripts, would have been kept. After all, we study the correspondence of scholars of the past. This is all gone, okay? So there's a fantastic fragility, and somehow, even though we're historians, we accept this destruction of historical sources on a barely unmanageable scale, in fact. Now, I mentioned a moment ago GeoCities, and it's a good example. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with cities per se. Okay, GeoCities was just the name of the service, let's say, that was provided to people to create their own web pages. Okay, it started in 1994 and it lasted until actively 2004, and then it was shut down in 2009. It gave the possibility to anyone to open a website for free, okay? After a year, it had a population of 10,000, okay? After 2 years, it had a population of 1 million. And at the end, it had a population of 7 million, which means that there were 7 million users who had created their web page that were organized. In fact, it was made, that's why maybe the name of GeoCity is not completely out of touch with the city, organized as neighborhood. And the neighborhood was basically topics. Okay, they would group the website by topics, they would link the website by topics, and then there would be what they call homesteaders to take charge somehow of the neighborhood, and et cetera, et cetera. And on this, when they came close to shutting down, there were already 186 million pages on which people documented their life, simple things, maybe uninteresting things, but also all sorts of things, emotions, memorials, talking about suicide, etc., etc., and 32 billion words. Now, compare this 186 million pages with, for instance, the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey is a record, the judicial archives of the UK. Okay, it covers 239 years. Do you know how many documents there are in these 239 years? 200,000. Okay. You can see that on the one hand, you have these 12, 13 years and this amount of documents, and these more than 2 centuries and 200,000 documents. So, of course, and we come back to that, you can say, wow, was it that interesting? But yes, precisely, it was interesting because it is a record of human activity. And this is exactly what we're interested in. And from these documents, we can certainly learn a lot about how people lived, experienced life, about their political opinions, etc., and etc. Now, in fact, I was saying a moment ago that in the traditional archives, there is a bias because there's a focus necessarily on institutions and etc. Now, we have the same situation with the web archives. The issue is who gets preserved, who gets saved somewhere. We have the capacity to do it. Of course, as I mentioned, there are goodwill people who do it, but it's not enough. So in the web archives, we have the same situation that some are in a better position to have their web pages, websites preserved. Mass media organizations, large corporations, of course, institutions, because they will maintain their own archives, and but which means that all these individual documents, archives, all these even websites or what I would call grassroots organizations are likely to disappear. And so we could end up with the same situation of imbalance. There would be an imbalance, but it could be worse. There's also an issue with who is connected and who is not. We have presently more or less 2.5 billion people who are connected, which leaves 4 that are not. Okay, so again, there is a bias here, definitely in favor of the more developed, more privileged countries. Even within the same country, the same privileged country like France, not everybody is on equal footing. It all depends on your age, on your level of education, on your income, social category, etc., etc. So the problem is, now that we have people who are somehow largely connected, how would we keep this? How do we preserve this so that in the future, we can still have an access to our past without too many biases? Last point before I turn to that. What I was just mentioning is nothing compared to what the internet giants are collecting. And this is another issue, because everything I was discussing previously are basically public web pages. Okay, what about the data collected by Facebook? Now, I give you another figure. Daily, Facebook collects 300 million photographs, 500 terabytes of data, 2.5 billion individual content, 2.7 billion likes. All of that reflects people's activities, life, etc. And Facebook is nothing compared to Google. Okay, and I will not give more figures, it makes sense. What I mean to say that all of these data are behind walls. We cannot have access to it. And we have no guarantee that we'll ever be able to access it. Of course, there are things that are made public, some metadata, some trends, some things like that, but the real content is not accessible to historians. So we now have a landscape where we have the potential to know far more about human culture, activity, what we call history than ever before. We have biases, and we'll see that the biases are not just the fact of having different conditions to produce data. It also has to do with the way we gather and preserve, I would say that. I would also say that web archives are not superior in any way to the traditional archives. They're just different, but different in many ways and unique in many ways. And this is where we need to adapt. They are different in the conditions of their formation, definitely, we'll see. There are serious ethical issues about how to use these archives. I will come back to that. We used to have, let's say, archivists, professional knowledge keepers for our archives. This is no longer the case. It's impossible. Nobody's curating this. So it's again another issue. Because we do not have this kind of fine-grained access. We do not have these finding aids that, a long history of archival studies have produced. We'll have to deal with archives if they were constituted, which is a massive thing, and certainly a massive thing. We, as historians, we have been trained in a certain way. We know exactly how the workflow, it works. If you go to archives, you expect to find finding aids. You expect to talk to archivists, okay? Then once you have your elements, you will just fill a form, send your request. Then you will get your boxes, you pull your folders, and you work on the documents. And somehow you've been guided to, as much as possible, the best directions to what is really relevant to what you do, okay? We have a long history of this on both sides. Archivists on the one hand, because they basically verify provenance. You know where the archive came from, okay? It's a basic principle, provenance. They preserve the original order. Is another basic principle of archives, okay? And there is what they call collective control, which means that archive is not an individual item, it's an aggregate of items. And you can see what can go from there about the archive. So where do web archives fit in there? And there we need first to perhaps clarify what we mean by web archive, because it's being used by a lot of people, web archive, the 9/11 web archive, the Katrina, what was it, the typhoon or whatever archive, the COVID archive. They are not archives, okay? They are digital collections. These are not archives. Archives, or web archives, should be defined as deliberate and purposive preserving of web materials, which is exactly what archivists have been doing in the past. But the issue for us now is to race against time. Because, as I said, things are constantly produced, but things are constantly erased as well. Somehow you can say it's good, because if we were to preserve everything, that would be impossible. But it's not just that, it's just that types of information that we used to have that were time-stamped no longer exist. Think about the yearbooks, which is an important source. We have these different yearbooks about China. We have these directories. You have the directory of 1933, the directory of 1941, etc. So you have, you have your list of people with the date and everything. And I could mention other sources. Nowadays, no longer exist. Because if you have this directory, it will exist. It will be updated regularly, and then what you get is just the latest one. You will never be able to put a timestamp on it unless everything has been preserved. Unless, of course, if it has been preserved, then you may have these various timestamps that would allow you to reconstitute who was doing what in this company at that time. Okay, so there's a constantly changing situation. Now, to preserve the past, there has been initiatives. The main one initially was a private initiative that you all know, I guess, in the audience or two, which is the Internet Archives. It was a brilliant move in 1996, quite early. 1996, decided to establish a farm with servers and to collect, save what was on the internet. Initially, it was a very raw way of preserving the data. Then Internet Archive developed something what they call Wayback Machine. The Wayback Machine was made available in 2001. It allows you to see websites as they were at the time, with lots of quotation marks, of course, because it's more complex than that. You cannot see the way it was, and we'll see it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible, inherently impossible to see a website as it was at any time. I would say why in a second. And then they also developed another tool which is called Archive It, which is mostly something for institutions, but you can, as an individual, you can use it to basically type the name of the website that you want to be preserved, and then it will start the gathering of the information of the whole website. Okay, so it's done systematically and automatically on the one hand, but it can be used for, and in fact, institutions, universities have been using Archive It to create web archives collection. Now, the second major actor have been national libraries. It started late, 2006, 10 years after Internet Archive. Okay, but now, basically, at least in Western countries, there is a legal deposit. And in fact, it's not the legal deposit per se that's being, even though like for my website, Virtual Shanghai, it's identified, there's a legal deposit of the website and everything. But it also means that these libraries also collect generally within their own domain. Let's say the French National Library collects everything in France or done by French people. Same in the US, same in the UK, etc. It's not clear to what extent other countries are doing it. I have no idea, for instance, for China. I have no idea for Taiwan, even though I suspect they will be doing it, but I have no idea. The paradox is that despite this collection by national libraries of these web archives, they are much more difficult to access than print sources, much more difficult. And it has to do precisely with the nature of the information that was collected. If you want to go and it wants to check this French web archive, first you have to go to the library itself, physically, which is quite paradoxical, right? You have to go physically. You cannot take any photograph. For decades now, have been used to go to the archive libraries and we take pictures. Impossible. You cannot download. So this is digital data you cannot download. And this basically has to do with issue of privacy and copyright. I'll come back to that. Now, how do they do it? How do they do it? Well, they use algorithm. Basically, it's called a crawler. It means that they send like a digital animal that goes to one page, looks up all the links on the page, follow the links, looks up all the links on the next page, etc., until you reach the end of the thing. So you can see that the way this is being collected has nothing to do with human intervention. It's an algorithm that creates the web archive, okay? And of course, behind this collection, there is no curation, because it's not possible. Also because it's not physically, technically possible. you can move a piece of paper like this in traditional archives. You cannot move a single piece of what you've collected in a digital archive because they are linked. If you delink, then you destroy an essential part. The hardest thing to imagine for historians is that there is no such thing as a page, as a web page. It does not exist. We have to forget the nice, unique document that we find in a folder. Forget that. A web page is made up of various disparate web resources that the web browser assembles for you. Okay? So you seem to see a page, but behind it, you have a complex, dynamic, and constantly changing process. Even the timestamps can be misleading, and this is a problem with the crawls. This is a problem because if you crawl a small website, it can be done quickly and everything will be timestamped the same way. If you crawl a huge website, by the time you start the process, the crawling, and the time you finish it, well, it may take hours or maybe days, I don't know, which means that, in fact, the last document that you collect may have changed compared to what they were when you started the process, okay? In other words, the crawlers reshape the archive, they shape the archive, they create the archive. It's not a snapshot. A snapshot would be everything taken in the very same time. And this cannot happen many times, most of the time. So for historians, it's a terrible issue. We are used to working with a very important notion of authenticity. An authentic document, we know what it is. We always do this work of verifying what documents we have in the hands. And this is external critique of the document. Here, it's complex because what is a document? But it's even more complex given these conditions that I just explained. And once it has been collected, then the issue remains of where to find them, how to read them, and what they are made of. Fortunately, again, Internet Archive developed a format which is called WARC. It's a short for Web Archive. In fact, it preserves Web Archive information in a linked form. This is, of course, fundamental. You need to have the links, otherwise nothing makes sense. So when they get a web page that does not exist, as I said, they gather everything, the file, and they combine this into one file with all the metadata blocks before each individual entry that constitutes the various elements. So what do we have and what are the issues with these web archives? Well, as I mentioned briefly before, it's not easy to access them for a very simple reason. There's a paradox. These web pages are public, were public, but they were private. They were produced by individuals. So when a library or any entity gathers this, there is no explicit consent. There is no form that you sign to say that you agree for your content to be gathered and preserved. Most people, when they publish a web page, do not think that it's going to be preserved somewhere forever and then accessible by people like me who will peek into your private life. Yes, as a historian, not because I'm vicious, just as a historian, but still, there's a huge issue here about the nature of the information that's gathered. It goes from, issues of simple intimacy to financial issues to all sorts of things. And it's all the more an issue for us because as historians, if we read something like this, if we cite something like this, then we need to point to the source, which means that, yes, you do make that source public in a way, okay? And then it means that the person who is in there may not be happy or probably will not know, but there's a huge ethical issue and a huge legal issue here. And this is why the national libraries are so difficult about giving access to this. So it's terrible in a way, because we know that by and large, our archives will be made of this. I assume that if the archive institutions are preserved in the same way, then there will be rules, the same kind of rule that we have for paper. But this whole world of non-institutional archives may become an issue for historians. Now, the last point the book makes is about, of course, historians, because historians have been very slow to adapt to this medium shift. And it's not just, as I will explain, not just the web archives. Because to be able to use these archives, we need to move from strictly our historical thinking, or at least to incorporate into our historical thinking, computational thinking. It means attention to interdisciplinarity. In other words, work with computer scientists, librarians. We need to be more aware of the origin and creation of the source, especially in this context of ever-changing contents and, of course, ever-changing standards, formats and everything. In other words, the data that's being collected will be extremely messy. It is very messy because it's being collected the way I said. It's produced by all sorts of people, but it would be a mistake, of course, as I said, to discard them. It would be another mistake to consider them somehow as a digital version of print sources. No, they are different. They represent something very different. And it would be a huge mistake to think that we can work with web archives in the same way that we've been working with print or manuscript archives. So there are some pressing issues here. For historians, the first thing is to become aware of how these systems decide what to prioritize, what not to, what gets preserved, what not. If I were to extend this to things that are closer to home for historians like me and probably most of you, it's the same with digitized sources. How much do we know, and we discuss that very often in the team, how much do we know of how they transform the print into digital? What methods, what formats, what quality control, unless we have this, we cannot really assess what we have unless we redo the job, and etc. So it's not so far from us that we have these issues. In other words, too, we need to be critically aware that, yes, algorithms are here. They are here to last. They are here to last for a long, long time. And we need to be aware that, again, how they work and what kind of result we have depending on what kind of algorithm we use. In other words, we need to be able to open the black box. Unless we do that, we'll be doing research in the blind. And of course, we cannot do that without acquiring new skills. I don't know whether you're familiar with PageRank. PageRank is a basic algorithm that Google developed. Unless you know what it is, you won't know what you get when you do a search in Google. Okay, and it's true of many other. We need to acquire these skills to understand algorithm, to sort, navigate, etc. Basic reason, we'll never be able to read every source. The volume is too huge. Okay, and this is true also of even now. If we have just one newspaper like the Shenbao and 100 years, it's impossible to read everything. If you want to get into the newspaper, we have to find a way to navigate, to search, retrieve, etc. So the issue that I'm discussing, which is web archives, of course, it's not for us today, because most of the materials that we have, in terms of archives, we know the Chinese archive will by and large never be transformed into full text, just because they're handwritten. Okay, this is not true of a lot of Western language archives, so we should be aware. We at ENP-China, we put tens of thousands of pages of digitized and authorized English language archives. Okay. And you're not going to read the 90,000 pages. Okay, you have to find a way to access it differently. So we cannot read every source. We cannot think that we can find a representative sample just like that without finding a way. Yet, if I can say a few kind words and reassuring words for some of you, you are not going to become programmers. There's no need to become a programmer, but you need to be able to implement with understanding the algorithm that others have designed to help you with the data. And there are good tools for that. The basic steps for those who have been working, won't be surprised about it, are when you are dealing with a massive corpus, well, first thing you need to be able to do is to extract the plain text, because we need text. Okay, it's a technical operation. We need to be able to do it, including from web archives, because web archives are made of lots of things, not just text. Then you need to be able to create a search index. It may be something new, but there are tools to do that, like Google, like Bing, like Apache Solar, for those who are. And then basically, you will have to filter. You will have to extract information, so it's name entity recognition. You will have to aggregate, and then you will go through visualization. And I would add in one more layer for web archives, it's metadata. Metadata will become essential because this is your port of entry, port of organizing your documentation, and you can use graphs for that. So I know that several of you are already familiar with this, but you can see that the way historians need to be trained now is very different from what we've been trained to before. Something that I said was familiar to us, the workflow, how we find things, how we use them, how we cite them, is no longer enough. As we move into digital tools, we implement digital tools on this corpora. For instance, this implicit action needs to be made explicit, which means, for instance, to note the search term that were used in the query, to provide the code or the script if the historian used a computational methods. And these are necessary conditions for complete transparency in our methods, and certainly more transparency that historians have been familiar with or comfortable with. Our citations need to have more information, such as noting that it was found in a searchable database, a microfilm, or the original newspaper. And this is true for what we do now. If we use the digital version of the Shempal, we are not using the Shempal. Okay? If it was a reprint, I would say Shempal reprint. Now we're using this version or that version. It needs to be made explicit. Okay, and this is true of everything that we use. So it's not just with Web Archives; it's already there. Beyond this issue of footnotes and explanations, etc., there's something more important, which is methods. When we work with digital methods, we need to put them in the foreground, not in the back, not in the footnotes, not on a blog somewhere, as we are often required to do. No, it should be part and parcel of what we do as historians. In other words, transparency is even more imperative in the digital age than it used to be in the pre-digital age. Now, just to conclude, or to not to extend too much this presentation, I would say that historians need to get up to speed with all of that. We need to begin thinking about born digital, or I don't know how to qualify them, digitized sources that now are at the core at what we do more and more. We have to recognize that born digital sources or digitized sources will be an increasing share of our sources. And we need to engage fully into this digital work, which means to develop collaborative work, collaborative models of scholarship, which means that, again, interdisciplinary work with other, work as teams, not just as individuals. We have to change this way of thinking, and certainly also address the issue of quantitative analysis. And beyond the fact of working as a historian, we also need to carve a place for digital scholarship within the profession. It's not recognized as it should be. Digital scholars are not pariahs, of course, but recognition, professional recognition, continues to be to rely on monographs and articles. Publications privilege subject matter over method. And most of the time, as I said before, method is just cut off from journal publications. There are good references for that. There's a white paper called Arguing with History, which lays the ground for that. And we need to train. We need to prepare the next generation of historians to work with the deluge of born digital sources, because this will fundamentally change their life and their profession. And this is what we're not doing currently. We're not doing it. History department do not train students, do not prepare them, do not prepare the doctoral students for research with digital data. And this is a shame, because we are historians and we have an immense privilege. We govern our norms. I mean, they are not dictated from outside. We are the one who evaluate, review scholarship. We are the one who edit the leading publications. In short, we decide what historians do. So it's really our job, it's our responsibility to get involved in this process. not in a binary way, definitely not in a binary way, in a Manichaean way. We're in this intermediate position. Most of us will never work with web archives. I assume. I won't. Okay. But my students will. Okay. Second, we are already working with digital sources because we're transforming massive amount of books, articles. The entire scientific literature is available now online. Can we just do as if it did not exist? No, we can't. No, we can't. So there is a fantastic opportunity, and this book should be read by every historian, seriously. There are other books of the same kind, though they tend to focus more on the history of the web or things like that. This book was written by a historian for historians, okay? And I believe that his arguments are especially convincing. And I hope that I convinced you, at least the happy few who were here today. Thank you very much. I'm done with my talking.